Can you eat gluten when you travel in Europe? If you have celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, you may have heard or read that some people go to Europe and eat gluten without suffering any consequences. I've heard this, so I know it's out there. So can this really be true? And I'll tell you what I did when I lived in Europe and give you some food for thought. Is the food in Europe different than in the United States? Well, this is really the question, right? You may have heard or been told that the food in Europe is healthier and less manipulated or less modified than it is here. And there is some truth to that. The European Union restricts or severely limits many food additives and preservatives that are commonly used in the United States. Many European countries also limit the cultivation and import of genetically modified foods. And the European Union also bans some drugs used on farm animals in the United States. Now, is wheat genetically modified in the US? Well, commercial wheat has not been genetically modified in the US, at least officially. So there has, however, been a lot of research done by big ag companies to study the genetic modification of wheat. And occasionally, genetically modified wheat has snuck in and shown up in commercial wheat fields that weren't supposed to have any genetically modified wheat. So this is all very confusing, but it appears that wheat has not been genetically modified and used for large commercial purposes. However, wheat has been hybridized, and that means that different varieties of the grain have been crossbred to create new varieties of wheat. Now, is the wheat different in Europe? Well, in short, yes, it is. A majority of the wheat grown in Europe is what's called a soft wheat. And a majority of the wheat in the US is a hard wheat. So these are different varieties. Now, so there is clearly a difference. And to make matters more interesting, the soft wheat in Europe has a lower gluten content than the hard wheat that we primarily get in the United States. Now, how much lower is that gluten content? Well, it may have as much as half or even a third the amount of gluten content as the hard wheat that you're more likely to come across in the US. Now, that may be why I've heard patients say after coming back from trips in Europe that they could eat the wheat there and not suffer nearly the consequences that they did here. Not to confuse that with me recommending that they eat it there. They just went and did it, all right? Now, it may be that the gluten content's lower, or it may be that they were relaxed and they're having fun and having a great time on vacation, and all this happiness and positive feelings made all the difference in the world. I mean, who knows, but all of those things are valid and they do have an impact. So the bottom line is, can you eat the wheat in Europe? Well, there certainly is a significant difference in the gluten content, or there can be, and I can tell you a personal story as well about how gluten content can make a big difference in how you feel. So in college, I had a roommate who is still a good friend of mine to this day. However, there was a day that tested that relationship a bit. His mom, who was a fantastic person, she would send him these care packages all the time, and she would bake this really amazing bread and send him other treats. And so one day he received a couple of loaves of bread, and I remember this really clearly, and he was raving about how good it was. And so he was really nice enough to share it with me. And I don't remember how much, but what I won't forget is how I spent the rest of the day and into the next day on the toilet with all the classic symptoms of IBS. Now, that was way before I know what I know now. I had no idea that I was gluten intolerant. But years later, when I discovered that I was highly gluten reactive, and when I told him, he told me that his mom would always use this special high gluten wheat flour in her bread. Well, of course, then I connected all the dots, right? And the light bulb went off, and I flashed back to our college days when I had eaten that bread. And so then it all made sense. So anyway, back to the question at hand. Can you eat the bread in Europe? Well, first off, let's remind ourselves that this wheat flour there is not gluten-free wheat, okay? It's lower gluten content than we're probably used to getting in the United States. And second, this is a really good piece of data that I want you to keep in mind. Many studies of celiac disease in Europe have shown that they have the same percentage of people with celiac disease as we see in the United States. So that's a clear sign to me that it's not really that much better, even though you may suffer a little bit less when you go to Europe. So although it's tempting to get comfortable and to try to eat the wheat in Europe when you're on vacation, it's not exactly good for you, even if you are lucky and you don't feel as bad eating it as you do in the US. So I lived in Europe for a year before I knew that I had a reaction to gluten. And I spent a lot of time being sick to my stomach and really tired, and I slept all the time. And then certainly way more than I do now. And I always needed a nap, and I'm sure that it was actually the gluten. It was why I felt so crummy and my digestion was a mess, but I didn't really pay any attention because I didn't know that was abnormal. So if I knew what I know now, if I knew that then, I wouldn't have eaten wheat or gluten at all when I lived in Europe. Now, I won't be eating it anymore either when I go to Italy later this year. And besides, Italy is basically the birthplace of celiac disease, so they have a lot of good gluten-free products there, so I'm not particularly concerned about it. So I don't want this to let it stop you from traveling, but I don't want you to get lazy and eat stuff that you know you shouldn't. You'll feel much better during your vacation, and you'll stay on track and continue to be healthy when you get back as well. Are you thinking about traveling anytime soon? If you liked this video and found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more useful content about how you can stay healthy.